Dr. Lookabaugh, thanks for joining the podcast again. It's always a joy to get to speak with you on these disease discussion episodes. And we're going to be discussing multiple topics here. So let's start with a very broad question. What type of mindset does it take to develop and execute a 12-month approach to plant health on warm season turf?
So in terms of mindset, I think you need to be proactive and start planning early. Start with the areas that always give you trouble, areas that you know you have recurring problems, and you're going to put more attention from the beginning in those areas, and then sort of build out the rest of your program with a focus on preventative maintenance.
Okay, in terms of plant health, what are some winning strategies here for boosting plant health on warm season turf?
To me, when we start talking turf grass, plant health really means more resilient turf. Golf courses are full of stressors, so low mowing height, heavy use of PGRs or growth regulators, you have foot and cart traffic. To keep the balls rolling really fast, the turf is also usually pretty thirsty. We're at the mercy of Mother Nature a little bit there. That can mean drought, heat, winter injury. Down south, we're gearing up for hurricane season, and so that means we've got heavy rains coming, you've got standing water. So on a golf course, it's usually we're either too dry or we're too wet, and then there's a brief window somewhere in the middle where the turf is actually happy. And so in order to keep that turf happy longer, that's where we focus on what we can control, solid agronomic practices and preventative fungicide applications. Obviously, our intrinsic brand fungicides, things like Lexicon Intrinsic, Navicon Intrinsic, Insignia, these fungicides deliver proven plant health benefits in addition to them being excellent fungicides. And some of the benefits that we can see are things like faster recovery from aerification, longer, more robust root systems. This turf is better resilient, more resilient during periods of heat, drought, or even cold stress. And to see the greatest benefits, the best plant health benefits, you want to make these products the foundation of your spray program. So apply them at regular intervals ahead of that plant stress. And that's how we built out that holiday spray concept. I know we've talked about that before, but really you're trying to maximize the disease control, but then also take advantage of those intrinsic plant health benefits.
Okay, us pesky writers, editors, podcasters use the terms disease management and disease control a lot. What's the difference between the terms, if any?
So I would say the difference in the terms is kind of nebulous. You can think of disease management as being a proactive or even a holistic approach, so prevent diseases before you see symptoms, whereas disease control is definitely more reactive. It's more stop the disease from progressing, getting worse, or actually killing your turf. So over the years, we've definitely shifted our mindset when it comes to managing turf diseases. The goal is still to reduce the aesthetic damage and then minimize any economic losses due to disease. And so I think we all start saying, hey, disease management, integrated management, this shift towards management thinking. But really, the goal is the same. And it's more about being proactive, getting ahead of the diseases, anticipating you're going to have diseases, and preventing them before you see them.
You're going all over the place in warm weather environments to look at golf courses and other turf. Based on what you see in your travels and your studies, what do successful warm season disease management programs have in common?
Probably the most successful ones are the ones that are a little bit more preventative and they're getting ahead of those diseases. They're sort of programming their entire season based on when they typically see diseases and making sure they're getting those apps out before that happens. So unfortunately, most of the turf diseases that we deal with in the Southeast are caused by soil-borne pathogens. And so these are pathogens that stick around a long time in those little, on your greens, on your fairways. They're hard to kill, and most fungicides really just suppress them long enough for you to get your next fungicide application out. So many of the more successful management programs, they definitely include regular fungicide applications, but the best superintendents are actually able to adapt and adjust their program on the fly. So they can back off sprays when conditions don't favor disease development. So if we're having, sort of droughty period, it's not very wet, pressure's kind of low, And then they can tighten their intervals when they see pressure ramping back up. And so that flexibility is really critical there. You know, those rigid 14-day calendar sprays that we all used to do, they definitely can be effective, but some of those apps, they get wasted. And then add that to the fact that many of the diseases that we deal with are actually stress diseases, or at least they're a lot worse when the turf is stressed. So trying to get a handle on your agronomic practices that improve your turf quality, you know, regular aerification, dethatching, getting on a good fertility program, get your irrigation management where it needs to be. All of those things are going to help you manage the diseases because you're improving the overall turf quality. And if you have healthier, happier turf, it's less susceptible to some of these diseases too.
You alluded to this earlier a few minutes ago, but how can a superintendent at a warm season course boost plant health and manage a disease simultaneously? That's certainly something that's exciting and a big change here over the last few years that those capabilities exist.
I laughed at this question because it's, you know, obviously the answer I'm going to give you is use intrinsic brand fungicides, right? No, but seriously, building in those foundational applications to your program is really critical because you can think about when you have the worst disease pressure and then plan to position your heavy hitters ahead of that. So I feel like a lot of times, you know, we save the best products for when there's a problem instead of using those best products ahead of the problem. And so I think shifting that a little bit and saying, hey, where do I need to position these key fungicides so that I actually do get the most out of them? So sometimes if you wait until you have disease and you're playing cleanup and catch up, you know, you're not getting the most out of those products. And so use your heavy hitters where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. So put them ahead of that really stressful time or put them ahead of, you know, that season where you know you start seeing disease every single year, every summer, whatever it might be. So really take advantage of where you position those apps and think more about foundational sprays and those key apps throughout the year, whether it's 4 or 6 foundational apps, and then you build in your other maintenance apps as you need them.
Well, that leads wonderfully to our next question. And I know everything depends on where your course is in this industry, but what time of year is the trickiest for a superintendent working at a warm season course to manage disease and promote plant health? Or are there just potential issues lurking all 12 months down in the regions you cover?
Totally, like you said, it really depends on where you are in the country. You know, if you're in South Florida or even the deep South, you have disease most of the year. If you're up in the transition zone, that window is definitely going to be smaller. For warm season turf, we like to put the biggest emphasis in the shoulder seasons. And that's because that's when your warm season turf is the most stressed. That's when your days are shorter, your temperatures are a little cooler. So Bermuda grass just isn't as happy in the shoulder season. Your turf isn't growing near as fast, and so that also means it's not going to grow out of the damage that was caused by disease. So late summer, early fall, those are really good timings to manage take all root rot, spring dead spot, and then once your turf wakes back up, if it ever went to sleep, spring, early summer, that's when you can start seeing your fairy ring pop off. So you want to get some preventative applications out at those timings too. That's kind of the critical times. In the past, everyone said, oh, you don't need to spray fungicides in the summer if you're growing warm season turf grass. Unfortunately, that's not the case. A lot of these pathogens are most active in the summer and they're doing all this damage, and then we don't see the damage until the fall, or maybe we don't see the damage until after winter. But those pathogens were active a lot earlier. And so summer applications are still necessary and needed in a lot of parts of the Southeast in particular.
Where and how do the intrinsic portfolio of fungicides fit into managing disease on warm season turf?
So again, it's that foundational application. We have a great history with our holiday spray programs, and they position those intrinsic apps at the key timings that control disease and then take advantage of the plant health benefits. So for us in warm season turf, you know, that's late summer, early fall, and then you can hit those early spring applications once your turf wakes back up. We also like to position one of those plant health applications or one of those intrinsic applications a week or so before aerification. One, because it'll help fill in your aerification holes faster, but also right around aerification is when we can start seeing fairy ring blow up. So as soon as you aerify, you may start seeing puffballs, and it's because you get air and oxygen down in that root zone, down in that soil profile where those fungi are active, and it can actually stimulate them a little bit. So we definitely like to make sure you get your application out ahead of aerification, and it sort of does double duty on fairy ring, but then also the recovery and fill-in of your hole closure.
So total teaser here, we have an upcoming print story about fairy ring and where some of these things Dr. Lookabaugh is talking about are fitting into a fairy ring control program. But for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to be talking about take all root rot and spring dead spot now that we got done with some of the broader questions. Dr. Lookabaugh, first, take all root rot. When during the season and on what parts of the golf course can take all root rot cause issues on warm season turf?
For take all root rot, we mostly see it on putting greens. Funny, actually, as more zoysia is starting to go out on fairways, we're starting to see take all on some zoysia as well. But for the most part, we see it on Bermuda putting greens. We tend to see symptoms pop up late summer to early fall. And then in some areas, we can see a lot of take all in the spring. So again, once that turf has woken back up after winter. That's a fairly wide window when the pathogens active and damaging roots before you ever see the symptoms. And so we kind of got to start thinking a little bit ahead of take all root rot in order to effectively manage it.
Yeah, and what type of conditions lead to the emergence of take all root rot?
Anything that's going to stress the turf is going to favor take all root rot. So your usual suspects, things like excessive thatch, poor drainage, over irrigating, low mowing heights, poor fertility, and then, of course, over-regulating, we'll typically see more take all root rot pressure.
And what are some proven tactics for successfully managing take all root rot?
So there are several fungal species that have been associated with take all root rot, and they all have slightly different temperature optimas in which the temperature that they grow the best. But in general, the pathogens are most active at soil temps between 77 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's where we want to focus our preventative fungicides. These pathogens can do a lot of damage to the roots before you notice the symptoms. So the successful programs are going to build in those preventative applications that start in the summer and keep going. Basically, they're going to continue through the early fall. So it's start early, keep going, and hopefully you've covered your whole window for take all root rot. The good news is a lot of the fungicides that you'd be putting out in the summer, whether it's for fairy ring, mini ring, or even as we move into the fall for spring dead spot, which we'll talk about in a second, those are all also doubling up most likely for your take all root rot applications as well.
Yeah, and let's get into the fungicide options. We've probably already mentioned some of them on the podcast, but which ones exist for take all root rot?
In general, your QOIs and your DMIs tend to perform the best on take all root rot, and your combination products that include a DMI plus a QOI usually provide a little bit better control than the solos. So from BASF, our best products are Navicon Intrinsic and then Maxtima. They both have excellent activity on take all root rot.
Yeah, and what can you tell our listeners about using those products? What times a year, what situations, where are they safe to use, Emma?
You want to apply preventatively throughout the summer, especially as you move into late summer, early fall. And the most important thing is to water in the application. So you want to get the product where the pathogens are active, and that's in the root zone. So water in that application with at least an eighth of an inch to a quarter of an inch of irrigation immediately after. You also want to be using soil wetting agents in the background about every 2 weeks, especially throughout the summer, so you get the most out of those applications.
Okay, now let's talk about spring dead spot a little. What have you learned about this disease on warm season turf through your time and effort studying it?
Spring dead spot really is the disease that keeps on giving. It gets worse over time, and damage is not always super predictable because it's largely dependent on how cold a winter we have.
And the name's totally deceiving, right? It's just not something that you worry about in the spring.
Exactly.
Yeah. When should a superintendent start thinking about this, or is it something that should be on the mind all the time?
Spring dead spot is actually managed with preventative fungicide applications in the fall. So the applications are most effective when your soil temps are between 60 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And usually we recommend you make 2 sequential applications about 28 days apart. In some areas, a third application may be needed. If you started your program a little on the early side, you might need to add a third app just to make sure you cover that entire window. But yeah, it's kind of funny because you manage spring dead spot in the fall.
Yeah. And what are some early signs that a course might be susceptible to spring dead spot?
Areas in the transition zone that are subject to more severe winters are definitely at greater risk for spring dead spot. So the pathogen actually nibbles the roots and it makes the plant more susceptible to injury. So all those dead patches you see in the spring are actually because of winter kill. It's not the pathogen killing the plant, it's the pathogen making the plant more susceptible to winter injury and death. So we've also seen more severe spring dead spot on courses that are heavy users of DNA herbicides, and it's because these herbicides can stunt the roots, and it can also, which can make them more susceptible to winter kill, but it can also slow in the recovery. So if you're using these herbicides spring of the year to prevent crabgrass and things like that as pre-emergent, you're actually slowing down recovery of those patches as well. So that's why I kind of say spring dead spot's the disease that keeps giving, because once you have those patches, very slow to heal, and you'll see the damage pretty much all season long.
So what you're telling me is that there are very few similarities between spring dead spot and other warm season turf diseases.
Yeah, I mean, few similarities, but we can manage them in similar ways. It's just, that winter aspect is a bit different.
And speaking of management, what are some strategies you recommend for dealing with spring dead spot?
You can't wake the dead, and with spring dead spot, you end up with dead turf. And so unlike some of those other diseases, your preventative fungicides are really critical as opposed to curative type or reactive type fungicide apps. Luckily, we do have a bunch of good options on the market. So from BASF, Maxima, and Navicon are kind of our go-to spring dead spot fungicides. Lexicon also makes a great rotation partner, particularly if you're spraying putting greens. But you have a lot of other options on the market. So things that include an SDHI plus a DMI combo tend to do really well on spring dead spot. But yeah, you've got several options for sure, which is good.
What are some keys to getting the timing and use of those fungicide options you just mentioned right?
Usually you want to trigger those apps around when your soil temps are around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a little bit of wiggle room. Some people start a little early, some people wait a little bit, but 70 is kind of a good sweet spot there. Make at least 2 applications in the fall, so sequential applications about 28 days apart. And then similar to what we do with Take All Root Rot, water in the fungicide applications with 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch of irrigation.
Okay, we've been doing these podcasts for a long time at Golf Course Industry. I don't think we've ever covered more than 20 minutes, Dr. Lookabaugh. Is there anything else you want to add about these big topics?
I think we pretty much covered all of it. I'd say try to be more proactive. Plan your program out, plan your seasons out, and especially with these diseases, start taking notes and mapping where you find them, because you're going to have them every year in the same places. So the more you know ahead of that, the easier it's going to be for you to manage it.
Well, thanks for your time. It's always great catching up with you. And thanks for explaining probably decades of research in 20 minutes here.
All right. Well, thanks. It was fun.